Hello. The A is for Architecture podcast new episode is a conversation with not one, but two North American scholars, social scientist Patrick Lynn Rivers and design historian Kai Wood-Marr, about their book, Situated Practices in Architecture and Politics, published by Dalhousie Architectural Press in 2024. In our conversation, Patrick and Kai speak of the importance of situated learning and practice, which involves architects engaging with communities to co-create knowledge, as a mode not just of transforming spaces and making things, but as an ethnographic means of seeing things through the eyes of communities. Situated practices, they argue, force a necessary politicization of design thinking, and are, as such, essential for architects to adapt to post-colonial challenges and contribute to global change.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I am recording today with two scholars from North America, Patrick Lynn Rivers and Kai Wood-Marr. Patrick, Kai, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your wonderful book, Situated Practices in Architecture and Politics, which is coming out with Dalhousie University Press. Thank you so much for joining me. Before we get into that, Patrick, Kai, would you be so kind as to introduce yourselves?
I'm Patrick Lynn Rivers, and by training, I'm a political scientist, and I'm probably the first political scientist you've had on the podcast, and maybe the last you'll have. I am a faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I teach mostly politics courses, but because of the nature of the school, I engage, every faculty member has to engage artists and designers at the graduate level and undergraduate level as well, which has kind of helped to form me as a scholar, but also as an interdisciplinary designer. I also have a design research practice called A Field, afield.ca. Look us up, see what we're all about. That we formed about a decade ago, doing projects at the intersection of design and social science.
And how does your engagement as a political scientist, how has that been, I suppose, infected by the practice of design? How do those two worlds come together in your own work?
Yeah, I came of age intellectually in the 90s as a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, trained pretty traditionally as a political scientist, but I found myself in kind of the hotbed of cultural studies in the United States, at least, between Lawrence Grossberg at UNC and Stanley Fish and the Fish Tank at Duke, which made me intellectually curious about many things, made me more open to ideas and different ways of thinking, different approaches, and increasingly more practice-based work, practice-based scholarship. So design has really sort of marked kind of advance from the place that I was as a graduate student, and this is a result of being at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is an amazing intellectual environment, amazing environment. I understand politics now a lot through spatial politics, the politics in environments. I understand politics increasingly through design, and specifically the power of design to transform lives, to transform environments, to transform our world. So I'm not the relatively traditionally trained political scientist I was in the 90s. I've come a long way.
It's interesting you mentioned this idea of design, and I guess we can play around with that idea because, of course, we customarily think of it as a privileged kind of disciplinary form which is reserved for, quote unquote, designers. It's not something that the world at large gets to do. We employ people to design for us in general. And I think that perhaps makes sense in terms of your own trajectory towards this idea of situated practices in the book that we'll be talking about. And also comes back to ideas around when you were talking before about the kind of professional versus lay knowledge that seems to be at the heart of your book. But Kai, before we go into that, Kai, would you now introduce yourself?
Thanks for having us, Ambrose. My name is Kai Wood Ma. I'm an architect and a design historian. I teach at MacEwan School of Architecture, which is in Northern Ontario, in Sudbury, Ontario, which is located above, for those who are interested where I am, above Lake Huron, Great Lakes, above on traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The school itself is tricultural, Franco-Ontarian, and Indigenous, and English. My kind of trajectory in architectural practice um, is primarily from my experience working up north in northern Quebec, working with Cree and Indigenous communities um, on um, on community projects. So that's my kind of architectural experience and training.
Fantastic. And how did a political scientist and an architectural design historian come to be working together? And how do these two aligned, perhaps, intersecting fields practically work together?
So, I mean, kind of met at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Kai was a faculty member, actually in art history here, working between art history and some of the design fields here. And we just started to have conversations and started to ask questions uh, that design in and of itself couldn't answer, that political science and social science itself, in and of itself, couldn't provide us satisfactory answers. And we started to think about ways that we could do things in the world, uh, in theory, through scholarship, but also practice, uh, to realize change. And as a result, a field was born, projects came to life, and I might have a different understanding of this, though.
Kai, how did you find it?
Yeah, we are both coming to design and Patrick in political science in ways that we care about not only the social dynamics around design, but also the materiality, the politics. So we both share similar kind of goals to which we want our respective professions to go in the direction. So when we started to collaborate, we realized that the collaboration co-produces new knowledge, a knowledge that we find just very useful for our profession, and then being able to allow us to do the things that we find meaningful in our respective practices. So, in many ways, then the collaboration has created something for us uniquely and new that we haven't seen in our own respective practices.
Does this inflect your teaching as well? Because obviously the book, Situated Practices, has at the heart of it the concept of situated learning.
Yes,
Do you find space for that within your own teaching practices?
absolutely, absolutely. And I think partially is because we're teaching architecture students, anyways, here in Northern Ontario, is somewhat very unique because of the landscape itself. Where we are in the Sudbury Basin, which is a former meteorite site where a meteor hit, one of the earlier that split the continents. And here we live basically among rocks in a mining town that has ecologically kind of ruined ecologically the because of the mining activities, transform the landscape and the landscape itself through local activism regenerated in the 1970s. And actually, it's a UNESCO recognized site for regeneration. And just being here and being able to have a focus on wood as a material for our design, and then living and thinking about the forests and different habitats that we that the places in transform the way we think about our projects here as well, and then also the lessons that can be learned from our local watersheds, for example,
Mm.
as part of our teachers too. Like
Mm.
not only what we can learn specifically about building, but how building itself can be implicated in many different implicated and entangled with the environment and in different situations.
That's great.
Can I hop in, Ambrose?
Certainly.
Yeah, actually, in my politics of globalization class last night, we were talking about migration and migration politics. And at a certain point uh, during the class hour, pulled out the newsprint and we all did blind contour drawings in a political science class, drawings of routes actually taken by migrants traveling from South America to San Diego. So, uh, and I regard this as a very situated practice.
Yeah. It reminds me of the work of Teddy Cruz and Fonna Foreman down in, I think, UCLA or UC Santa Barbara as well. And it's a rich area. The book Situated Practice, of course, and this idea of situated learning builds on that, is, as I said, it's a wonderful piece of work. But I guess for the listenership, it would be really interesting to understand better what you mean when you talk about situated practices, where it comes from and as an idea, and the foundations of this idea. And I guess from a scholarship perspective, most importantly, where your idea develops this concept. And that's basically me asking you to define your entire careers, which I
Yeah,
apologize for, but, big questions, big people.
I think the bumper stickerish response would be situated learning and situated practice, or learning and practice uh, deeply uh, sort of making use of learning
Hmm.
with others to create new knowledge. And we're definitely indebted in the book to Levin Wenger and their situated learning book. But also, I guess, Wenger later on in his work on landscapes. We are also indebted to Michel Desserteau uh, and Paulo Freire, whose work is concerned with more bottom-up concerns, thinking about democratic politics, democratic practices, thinking about liberation, thinking about horizontality in relations, political, social, economic, cultural. Uh, a little bit more indebted to Donna Haraway, obviously, the Situated Knowledges paper from the late 80s, uh, but more indebted, I think, uh, to Haraway through her later work, some 30 years later, Staying with the Trouble, and uh, the ways in which that work contributes to, for example, relational ontologies. Also indebted to Karen Barad, Meeting the Universe Halfway, um, work also engaged in relational ontologies. I think we advance this conversation by situating it more uh, in architecture and design practice.
Mhm.
And we're very concerned about the practice of practice, the practice of architectural practice. And for us, I think Levin Wenger were more easy to access because they talk about apprenticeships, and many of those apprenticeships are design apprenticeships or apprenticeships in design adjacent professions. But I think we advance this work by advance situatedness, situated practice, situated learning, by bringing it to design with a particular political edge. We are especially concerned with marginalized communities, especially marginalized communities in the global South, and what they have to offer architecture as profession. And I think that uh, is a big difference, something that we bring to the table,
Mm.
new. And yeah, I mean, Kai probably has more to say on
Yeah,
this.
in architecture school, we often, in more traditional architectural education, we are taught techniques, we're taught subject matters, for accreditation, but we're rarely taught how to learn. And learning itself, we require reflection and as a technique. And over the years of collaborating with Patrick, we have learned that learning itself, that we're situated learners, and learning itself can be very useful for our students, especially for young aspiring architects and designers who want to contribute or to have a meaningful practice. And being able to learn as a subject matter and then also being is important to us. So so in some ways that yes, it's not so much as so as Patrick said, learning is a practice in itself, and then it's a practice of practice. How does one learn in their design and architectural practice?
Especially from others who are
Yeah.
different than you as the design professional.
Yeah. This idea of the apprenticeship, am I right in thinking that in a situated practice, it is the architect or the designer who becomes the apprentice of the community, who is taught the values, meaning, logics, spatial hierarchies of a place, and in that way is apprenticed to the community to understand it better? Or am I misunderstanding here?
That's definitely the case. We're very much about uh, turning around or turning upside down the hierarchy, especially as
Hmm.
professionals relate to subaltern communities, to marginalized communities, and that these communities have important lessons. But the the practitioner, the design practitioner, the architect, has to engage these communities
Hmm.
in what we consider the extra architectural ways. So, for example, one of the chapters in the book is about a Thai architect named Padma Roonrakwit, and she did a community development project for the Thai government. She spent a few weeks walking around a community, having coffee with people, talking with people. And people in the community didn't even know that she was there to do a job, that she had a project there. And, this definitely isn't, these aren't billable hours. Similarly, there's a chapter in the book on community center uh, collaborative project by Paulo Mendes de Rocha, one of his last projects with MMBB, uh, Sao Paulo, smaller Sao Paulo firm. We interviewed Marta Moreira, one of the principals there, and she talks about walking from her apartment to their office to a particular site, this community center in the center of Sao Paulo, learning as she walks, engaging as she walks, uh, engaging hair braiders who uh, have informal businesses around this particular site, engaging informal workers on so-called short stays who sleep around the site. And as the project was completed, actually end up sleeping in the community center and some of the uh, more public spaces. We One of the chapters is about an historic preservation project on one of the rock-hewn churches in Lalibela, Ethiopia. And we did an interview where we interviewed the two principal architects, Vassal Georgis, who's an Ethiopian architect, but also Stephen Battle, who works for the World Monuments Fund, British architect, pretty traditionally trained. When we first started the interview, he gave me gave kind of very normal, institutionalized architecture answers. As the interview went on, though, he started to talk more about uh, how he learned, what he learned um, in what he himself called as an extreme act of humility. The community there in Lalibela taught him something about faith that they don't teach you in architecture school. They don't teach you in architecture school that for religious communities, in this particular religious community, the rock from which the churches have been carved are basically faith given form.
It's a very beautiful idea. It's a very elegant expression as well. I would love for one of my students to come forward at a crit and argue for that. My gosh. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, of course, in the context of our own educational process in the global north, if a student were to come forward and say that, I think all hell would break loose. But that's something to do with the way that we perceive or conceive of architectural knowledge, of professional knowledge, and the identity of the architect in that. And it seems to me that what you're proposing, what you're describing in the cases, is a conscious attempt to shift the identity of the architect. How does that work? And what value does the architect have in that process? What value their professional knowledge? And on a very practical level, how do they communicate that value?
Yeah, Bruce, that's correct. That's exactly how we see situated practice, particularly for designers and architectural practitioners. That one is reflexive of the traditional or professional responsibility as an architect, and often we see it as a skilled base, and also our responsibility for making buildings safe. But I think beyond that, there are other ethical issues that I think architects engage in or are responsible for. Um, in that way, when we think about what we often refer to as extra architectural, are the elements in which an architect can hone their skills in in learning with and co-create knowledge with communities. A good example for us is Guillaume Levesque and his work with the Kitsisaki community, where he spent a lot of time learning about the landscape by going fishing with people in the community. So he would create relationships with the landscape, with the people, and understanding how the situation is, and it is part of that architectural work for him. Um, so, so yeah,
But it blurs the line, doesn't it, between the professional and the recipient or the client, and that's difficult.
it is incredibly difficult, but it's also deliberate and intentional.
Mm.
Blurring the line, making it as part of that practice is very important. Well, with the practitioners we feature in the book, that most definitely when they enter a situation, they are curious and they learn, and they're open to learning um, with the community. So in many ways, yes, it does blur the line between the expert or the architect having the skill and the community who possess the knowledge. But the knowledge is gained by co-creation.
Patrick, could you speak to the communication of this? I know you're not the architect here, so you're not the guy that does the drawings. But one of the things that we rely on within our professional discipline as a profession is that we have these kits, these tactics that we deploy, drawings, modeling, model making, and forms of language that we also deploy to demonstrate our competence and our professional reliability and so on and so forth. It seems to me that to adopt a situated practice approach, as you describe, would require new ways of communicating architecture with a little a, not with a big A.
Yeah, I think it takes place in different ways, that unfolds in different ways, depending on the practitioner. I think about Lacaton and Vassal. There's a chapter in the book about Lacaton and Vassal, their School of Architecture in Nantes. But we spoke with them in their Paris office for a few hours about their social housing projects. And, they themselves, two of the most famous architects in the world, go door to door with tape measure, clipboard, and calculator uh, to learn about the environment in which the residents live. And in fact, uh, they don't really use professional drawings. The professional drawings don't come until the very end, they told us. I think in terms of communication, that communicates uh, a concern for the residents, a concern for the inputs of these residents in a social housing project. I think it creates a more horizontal. It communicates a more horizontal relationship between uh, uh, resident, client, and the professional, the architect as professional. I think it's also communicated in a different way. In one of our earlier projects about a housing development in a township in South Africa, where communication was made possible uh, through drawing and in particular mapping. It allowed mapping, which can be a very technical tool used by architects, was actually used to facilitate communication between design professionals and the community for whom normal and institutional architecture was not necessarily intended. It was a drawing or a use of drawing uh, that uh, was more about including uh, township residents in the conversation, uh, empowering them to speak about their environment, um, uh, but also to facilitate communication in a more democratic, more horizontal way. Kai might have more to say about that and mapping and drawing and how we actually use it in our practice and understand mapping and drawing.
Right. The drawing is a really good example where one of our tools as architects, we draw, but then they're not drawing to represent or drawing to build. But in many ways, the drawing became an exercise of inclusion.
As a
Um,
communication tool, as a communicative
it's a
tool.
communication tool that that gets people to the community to realize that they have power. They have power, and then that they have authorship in the collaboration of creating the housing for themselves and their right to the land. So it in many ways that the drawing itself is acting as more than for the purpose of design and construction, but there is a kind of as part of a social practice that can be used with drawing itself.
Patrick, you've mentioned South Africa, and I think one of the critical aspects of this book, as I read it, is this possibility of a post-colonial architectural practice. And the book travels around the world. Ethiopia you've mentioned, Thailand you've mentioned, Canada obviously, the States, Brazil. Do you see in these practices commonalities? Because I think that would be a fascinating idea. And for me, it would start to situated practices perhaps within postmodern culture. An idea of a contextualized practice, in a way a social version of Frampton's critical regionalism in a peculiar kind of way. But also, if we're dealing with a post-colonial kind of architectural form, how do you see situated practices enabling us avoiding, I guess, modernist and paternalistic models?
I think the projects highlighted in the book were very carefully selected. Diverse projects, diverse practices, diverse practitioners. I think 4 of the 5 chapters speak to post-colonial themes very directly. Uh, but I think post-colonial contexts uh, have the possibility of teaching us uh, to uh, sort of interrogate uh, normal practice, institutional practice, and to engage practice in new ways as practitioners to these to as Raul Malhotra actually says, these new types of clients as the global South rises. It I think the potential engaging post-colonial challenges has the possibility of reshaping professional practice away uh, from more traditional ways of practice that might highlight wind studies. Not that wind studies aren't unimportant, um, but the social, the political, economic are important as well. And understanding those and navigating the challenges posed by the social, political, economic are important uh, as well.
I'm fascinated by this idea. If architecture is concerned with ultimately, it's concerned with the production of space, then how do you translate this knowledge gained through a situated engagement into space? Where does design happen? Who is the designer? And at what point does someone take ownership? Because for me, the profession of architecture is closely linked to liability. Someone has to be the fall guy, right? Someone has to take responsibility to deliver the thing, community center, housing, office block, in a way that is reliable. That's not going to burn down. It's not going to fall down. It's not going to get flooded. People aren't going to get trapped in their beds, whatever it is. So, how do we take this knowledge, this situated learning, and spatialize it, formalize it?
Well, for us, it's not situated practice doesn't replace traditional architectural practice or an architect's liability, but it's something that is added to an architect's toolkit.
Right.
And it's as much as an approach and a sensibility that an architect can develop. And then also on the question of when does situated practice begin and when does knowledge begin in terms of thinking about space, I think they all are so much kind of enmeshed together that the production of space is the production of knowledge. So there's really no actual separation between thinking about space, thinking about materiality, and then also thinking about the way we learn or conduct on an architectural process or architectural project. So where does it begin? It begins the moment, I think, when we enter a situation. One enters a situation, it begins and it gets negotiated, co-created. So there's really it's constantly moving and it changes throughout the process of an architectural project.
That's very helpful. That's a very elegant description of it. I want to jump back actually to what Patrick was talking about, this idea of a situated practice adequate for a post-colonial world.
Mhm.
How have the projects that you've looked at, particularly from the Global South, how have they informed your thinking about how projects might occur in the Global North? Is there space in perhaps what we would see as being fairly ordinary spaces in our own context of North America or Western Europe, as I am in? And you've mentioned Lacaton and Vassal, where this form of situated learning, this situated practice, has real value. Are there parallels between the kind of forms of marginalization that you see in decolonized situations? And I suppose this goes, Kai, to where you started this conversation from, which is talking about the indigenous populations in your own part of Canada.
That's right. And maybe, Patrick, we could talk about Kitsikasakic situation where Guillaume Levesque's practice with the community unsettles or decenters knowledge, right? The very practice of the architect can, through co-creation, allow for new forms of knowledge being created. So in that case, it's a good example in which the Southern theory or knowledge from the South can actually inform the Northern context.
In the conclusion to your book, you suggest situated practice is a survival guide. I'd like to understand that better. But I would also like to understand better the way that you view situated practices as an instrument for essentially politicizing design, for not allowing architectural design to drift off into rococo frilliness and irrelevance, I suppose.
Mhm.
Is that a fair way of describing it? That it is both entirely necessary for the continuation of the profession as it is in a post-colonial world, but also that to do that, it transforms architecture into this political vehicle.
I think in terms of a survival guide, we very much see it as a survival guide, especially for students and young practicing designers, but also mid-career professionals as well, as capitalism and neoliberal forms of capitalism have changed the profession, impacts the profession, and basically in a context, a very political context, where more senior practitioners find themselves uh, with fewer and fewer projects to to pitch proposals for, and for diminishing uh, sort of returns in terms of payment income, but
And,
also I
and
think
reputation and all of the things that we have normally
for sure
accepted lower pay for.
those things are uh, the profession isn't what it used to be, um, and especially for young architects. And you think about the cost of their education, you think about the length of the education, you think about, the internships, and you think about, for example, our students are thinking about the impact of AI on their career prospects and their practicing careers. But I think what we're offering and what we're saying is that there's something more fundamental about architecture. I mean, not that getting paid is unimportant, but architecture and social uh, architecture and situated practice and situated learning offers young designers, more senior designers, and architects something else. And that is the opportunity to learn, but also to participate in the transformation of their communities, the transformation of their profession. Um, so Kai actually teaches architects, young architectural students more than I do. So
Yeah.
he's the actual architect in this partnership. So he probably has a lot more to say about this.
We find that students coming into architecture school, they are really interested in in contributing to global change and in seeking meaningful practice. And I think situated practice is a way to say, hey, you know, architecture is a profession, but there's more than a profession. It is one's practice, and looking at it as a practice, and one's agency in being part of contributing to knowledge creation, making changes to one's environment is key to why we wrote the book, and it's important. And and I think that kind of seeing Situate practice as something that is optimistic, and as something that feeds one's practice as one develop one's practice or in the profession. It allows the practitioner to kind of like have something that they do as their practice, right? In addition to what is expected of them professionally.
You mentioned this idea of contributing to global change, and you talk about agency. And just as a
Mhm.
last question, and it's a question I've asked Jane Rendell, who teaches situated practices in the University College London, and Amika Dahl, artist and architect, who also teaches in that field. And I think it's an important question, which is how do you scale this? Because you talk about individual projects and you talk about individuals' practices, and there's something very time consuming and invested in this kind of process that you're talking about. How do you scale this up in such a way that it can be proposed as an adequate strategy for addressing the crises and the inequalities that you've spoken about?
I think a lot of the scaling has to do or will need to take place in architectural and design education itself. I mean, I'm sure this is why Randall has turned to and developed and been the driving force of that situated practice program. But I think some of the things that, in particular, Kai and his colleagues at Laurentian are doing in terms of training young designers, young architects, uh, is really important in that scaling.
Does it need to be scaled? Is it enough that we do 100,000 tiny situated projects? Is that where the scale happens?
Well, one must remember that, the architect isn't working alone. And when we see architectural practice as a collaboration, working together to produce knowledge, then you see the scale in less of one's expertise in making change. But we're actually seeing a collective here. Who you're including, who are the community of practitioners, kind of in itself scales up, right? The more people, more knowledge is coming together in tackling an issue, no matter how tricky that issue is, it's not burdened by one expert or a team of experts. We're actually talking about collaboration across disciplines and also collaboration, thinking that it's not only human intervention, but that partially even the more than human would be participating in the way we think about transforming the landscape or improving the environment. So it's the architect or the team of architects are not alone, and their skills are important, but it's this collaboration that I think is a way to think about how we might be able to work on larger projects, and then having a way to talk about this across regions, even if we even talking about kind of larger scale, planetary scale. Some of the work on bioregionalism I think is doing some of that work, rather than seeing exclusively within provincial or national boundaries, but actually thinking that, hey, none of this is actually confined to or as bounded as we understand it, have understood it, and it's not. so much the site itself, but then that we're connected. So if we start to understand that we are learning together within the community and across communities, and the way we could connect to each other by working together through situated learning, it could really scale up and seeing the work as a collective through different scales.
Brilliant. That's a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Kai. Thank you so very much, Patrick. It's been a pleasure to speak with you twice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Because of time being an arrow, I had to imagine everything. That's from Sun Yung Shin's Return of the Native. I like it, the whole poem. But that first line spells out something like the imperative to change things Kai and Patrick seem to me to advocate for. Thanks to them for speaking with me, for tolerating the mistakes and all, and for sharing images and the book. And thanks to Suzanne Marshall at Dalhousie for connecting us. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Patrick and Kai's online presences. And thank you for listening.